All right, so here we are. We are here on March 22nd, 2023. Uh, I'm pretty sure I know where we left off here. I know we didn't finish the advanced SQL discussion last week, so I do want to go ahead and go into that. Also, this week we're supposed to be, I don't have it here, we're supposed to be doing database development. We will go ahead and get into that. If we don't get into it today, we'll do it tomorrow. Because what I think my plan is for today is to do the advanced, continue and finish off the slides on advanced SQL. Again, I need to rename this. It's not really advanced so much as it is a different type of thing that SQL does. Remember the initial SQL discussion, SQL discussion was all about data, about how to see and manipulate data within the database and within the tables. Advanced SQL, as it's named here, is more accurately probably defined as data definition side of SQL, where we are manipulating the structures themselves. Okay, so, but first, all right, I use this quote because I love this quote for the database development side of things, also for software engineering in general. Attributed to Winston Churchill, he who fails to plan is planning to fail. Basically, what I often tell people, if you know anything about software engineering and you know anything about software processes, about how to develop systems, basically there is a process name called ad hoc, which basically is you sit down and start working on the problem without much planning involved. I kind of compare that to how first-year programming students tend to do their assignments. They tend to kind of just sit down and start typing away and, oh, where does it fail? Where does it not work? Oh, let's fix that. But hopefully, the more time you spend learning these concepts and taking these courses and whatnot, you start to figure out that, if I make a plan of how to solve this, that maybe it goes a little bit better and things go a little bit smoother once you actually start doing the thing. All right. So if I'm not mistaken, we left off talking about views, right? Is that correct? If that's wrong, can someone make sure to correct me? I hope. Okay. All right. So one option for a view, and we talked about, so there's a few different versions of views here. One is, let's see, let me go back. Actually, I'm going to go back a few slides. So again, we need select privileges. I do remember saying that. Okay, so we talked about this manager 3 staff, where we see the different staff people from a particular branch. All right. We see staff 3, which would be all staff information from a particular branch, but we limit what columns they're able to see because they're not the manager. All right. I think we talked about this too, about the table, where in a previous example, we talked about creating a table and using an insert statement, using a select to insert into that table. We did also, yeah, because we talked about the differences between whether to have a view-based approach or a table-based approach, right? And we had that discussion about why tables can be faster as far as selecting the data, because the data is actually stored there, whereas the view is slower, can be slower about getting the data because it calculates it when it's requested. But there's the drawback, the negative side of having a table, and that it takes up extra space, right? The view doesn't take up extra data storage, at least not on the level of a table, to be able to store that information. And also depended, we also talked about how it depended also on how frequently the data may change, right? That if the data changes frequently, then we also need to do extra work to keep the table up to date if we store it as a table, whereas the view will always have the most up-to-date information if the data changes. All right. So we did also, I think I also mentioned this thing, I did get to this, where we drop a view. If we drop a view, it gets rid of the definition. Again, it doesn't delete the data. Dropping a table deletes the data as well. Dropping a view does nothing to the underlying data because it doesn't do anything to the underlying tables. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about how the view resolution comes. So remember, staff prop count is a view, right? It's that view that we looked at. This one. Yep. So here's our view here, right? Where we are. It has an underlying subquery, right? It has a query here. All right. So when we select something from that view, right? So we look at it, the way we look at this is we look at this as if it were a table, because a view is like a dynamic table. It's a table. It's like a table that does not actually have the data stored in it. It uses underlying tables to get their data, but we treat it just like we would a table. So we're saying, give me this column, staff number, and this column, count from this thing. All right, treat it like a table, and we're going to have a where clause. Okay, so we're going to add this condition to it. Right, and we can also order by as well. Okay, now the way this gets resolved, because remember what staff prop count looks like. It's a subquery, right? So it's saying, okay, I'm going to get the underlying table, the underlying query. It's staff number column. All right, and this as count, right? Okay. The view names and the from are replaced with the from the table and the from. And the where clause has both the where clause as it exists in the view, and it's anded with whatever extra conditions we put on it. So this one here, right, this part here was from our view definition, and this part here was from our query where we used a view. All right. This group by, right, comes from the query for the view. And then we included this order by, so this part order by came from the query that we're using the view with. That's query what we wrote. So let me, this is 37. Okay. So when we write this, right, what gets sent over to the DBMS for it getting data, it gets sent this. Okay, in a sense, right? So when we go to look for the tables, we need to get the data from these tables with this combination where clause, the group by from the view, the order by from our query. All of it gets packaged together. Okay. All right. Now, sometimes we can update views. Let's see. By the way, these next couple of slides are out of date. Actually, what I learned recently is actually, so this does not fail anymore. So this actually would still work. Okay. I think this also succeeds in the most recent version of MySQL. So these slides are a little bit out of date. Older versions of SQL would not have allowed for this. Newer versions and maybe even newer versions of different SQL tools like Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server or Sybase SQL Advantage might still reject a query like this. I know from at least the last time I taught this class, a year ago, these queries both succeeded in MySQL. So take that for what it's worth. So these slides maybe, I don't want to call them necessarily outdated because I don't know about the other SQL technologies, about whether or not they would allow these queries or not. So yeah, so just know that sometimes these slides may not reflect your experience depending on which version of SQL and which tool you're using. Okay, let's see, let's move on. Okay, this is what I was trying to get to, was about the view updatability. Okay, so sometimes we can update views. There's some rules about updating the views. So we can, let's say we wanted to insert into this staff prop count view that we created. We want to insert these values. So this branch, this employee, this staff person is overseeing 2 properties. But this wouldn't succeed, right? Why would this not succeed? We can't give 2 properties to that staff person? Anyone? No one. Yeah, Eclames. Eclames. Dormo. Eclames, right? Yeah, Eclames. Anyone? Teshikalet. Okay, so you can hear me. I know you guys can hear me now. Right, yeah, we don't know the properties, right? Remember this information here, okay? This little value right there, right? It represents something, right? It represents that SG5, the staff person, their primary key, their ID shows up twice. Like if this were to be inserted like this, it would show up twice in the property for rent table. That's what it represents. So because we don't know what rows to insert or what rows to give them, right? In the property for rent table, we can't just add 2 to this view, right? We can't just add this to this view. We don't know what the properties are that they are managing, right? Now, so if the view were defined as this instead, okay, where now we're having, okay, the staff property list, right? Where we get a branch number, a staff number, and a property number, not the number of properties that they're managing, but the specific properties that they are managing. Now we could insert into this branch, staff number, property number in order to give them the management of a particular property. But what we couldn't do is we can't use this to add a new property that they are managing, right? Because if we were to try to add PG19, for example, as a property number, right? We know the staff number for it, but what about other non-nullable columns like like address and owner and things like that that might be not nullable that we cannot we don't have that information through this query. Okay, so we can either change the table. If we change the table to make it to where there were no other nullable columns, non-nullable, where every column was nullable, basically, except for the primary key, PG19. Okay, then we could do this, right? But that would be a very particular situation. Okay, so rules about views being updatable is basically listed here. I personally, just in my own practice, granted, I don't have a ton of experience as a DBA, as a database administrator. I've never been a database administrator, but even my primary job on the projects I worked on were the user interface side of things and not necessarily directly the database side of things, but I did do that. Our companies never really used updatable views. We updated the tables directly. So I don't know if that's normal or not. Maybe more companies do updatable views. Maybe William could speak to that. I don't know. But the main thing is that you do kind of need to know in certain situations that views are not updatable. Okay. Let's see. Let me skip through the check option stuff. You should have an idea, at least a good understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of views. Okay, more advantages than disadvantages, but one of the things specifically that we talked about was improved security and reduced complexity. Because remember, that big ugly query, right? This one, like without a view, this is how we would have to write this query to get this particular information, right? Where if we wanted to know the staff people and the number of properties they are managing at a particular branch, we would have to write the query like this, right? If we have our database programmer write a view for us, though, that view that we talked about, this one, right? Then our query that we have to write looks like this, which is a lot easier, right? I hope you guys all agree that this is a lot easier to write than this, right? Okay. So back to so reduced complexity, data integrity, and we know that we always get the most up-to-date data, right? There can be performance issues. I did talk about that, because if we always get data directly from the table itself, then we're always getting data immediately, basically. So there can be a slight reduction in performance, especially the more and more complex that our views get. It becomes much more of what we call a bottleneck. You guys know what a bottleneck is? Does anyone know that term? Oh. Okay, so William says he would not allow programmers to update data from views, period. Then it sounds like the companies I worked for are following along with William's policy there. Okay, so a bottleneck. So I have it's a big water bottle, but it's blurry. Right, so I have this water bottle here, right? So if I were to take a normal water bottle, if it were open, and if I were to turn it up, right, it could only flow at a certain rate, right? And what would be the limiting factor of how fast the water could come out of this bottle would be the thickness of this, right? The neck of the bottle. And so a bottleneck is anything that reduces the ability of speed of something to flow, right? Or something to do. And so so what I was getting at with that is that the more and more that views become complex and use a lot more tables and a lot more conditions and stuff like that, it can slow down the view, which can slow down the application. And a good DBA, one of the things that a DBA will do is they will monitor those things and they will tune those things, and they'll do things that we'll talk about later in the semester, stuff like the latest called indexing, where we index columns and stuff to help make those things run more smoothly and quickly. Yeah. All right, so let's get to I do want you to know these terms, commit and rollback. Now, MySQL kind of does these things automatically, but not all not all SQL utilities do. But basically, a commit is when we make whatever changes we've made, whether it be an insert, an update, a delete, anything like that. We commit it to the database, and that after that point, then other people accessing the same database will see the changes that we've made. Okay, a rollback will go back basically to the last save point. Okay, so the reason why we have these and what makes this helpful is that if you imagine that you are doing a lot of changes and updates and updating values and insert rows into a table or into multiple tables, right? But you only want all of the data to basically change publicly at once. Okay, so it's processing through, making changes, and then once you're done, once your process, your procedure is done, then you want to commit those changes for other people to see. Okay, so you don't want them to see it. You don't want them to see that this row has changed until all the rows involved have changed. Okay, so that's what a commit does. A rollback says, okay, because another big part of this too is what happens if we're updating, we run, you know, a sequence of a half a dozen update statements. Okay, and remember, each update statement can update many more than one row, right? But let's say we're running a half a dozen update statements, and if for some reason the last update statement fails, right? But we don't want the other three to succeed if the last one fails. We want all of them to succeed or all of them to fail. Like we cannot have part of them succeed. And I actually had that happen. That was like what it's called a stored procedure in Oracle. We actually had to write some. I can remember distinctly having to write a stored procedure that did that, where basically we were updating a flag column on the rows of a table based upon certain conditions. And so basically you updated the flag to an integer value from 1 to 4, or left it blank, left the row blank under certain conditions. But we had to do 4 different updates because it was like a hierarchy of it, right? So update it to 1 based on a certain condition, update the rows to 2 based on a certain condition, 3, 4. But if for some reason 3, 4, whatever, if it failed, we didn't want the 1s and 2s to show up, right? Because what we needed to do is we needed to figure out, okay, why are these failing, right? Before we do it again. So what a rollback does is we can say, go back to the last commit and return my view of the database to that. Okay. So the tool that we used for the last company I worked for was called Toad. It was an Oracle, well, it was a database utility called Toad. Right, like you're moving money between 2 accounts, and let's say we update account A to receive the money, and then we update account B to remove the money. And let's say the first update succeeds and the second update fails for some reason. Well, now the money's in both accounts. I don't think the bank would like that, right? I don't think the bank would be okay with that. And so they would want to have either both. That's a great example, William. Thank you. Either they want both the money to show up in the other account and be removed from this account, or they want both to fail. Like the money doesn't get removed from here and it doesn't show up here, right? They don't want one of those to succeed and one of those to fail, right? So we can roll back. Yeah, so that's how commit and rollback work. Again, MySQL, I think natively, and there may be a setting you can change on this to allow for this, but natively it doesn't use the commit rollback. So it just automatically, when you run an update statement or an insert statement, you click go and it does it automatically, and it's done, right? So, one thing that I wanted to say too is, again, commit and rollback are about what you see locally, what your stored procedure or your user interface view with the database. If you're using a tool like Toad or something like that, changes made during the transaction are visible to you, but not visible to others. Once the commit happens, changes you've made are visible to you and to others. If a rollback happens, it goes your view, I don't want to use the word view. Your version of the database goes back to what everyone else sees. Okay. All right. Where are we? Okay. So some different completion options for a transaction. A commit ends the transaction successfully, making all the changes permanent. A rollback aborts the transaction, backing out any changes. Okay. Program termination can basically end the transaction successfully and kind of make a commit happen. All right. Abnormal program end aborts the transaction. Now, there was something I was thinking about this. Oh, one other thing about this is if you, because what's kind of happening during the transaction, during the stored procedure, if it's a stored procedure that's running, is as there are changes being made that are not committed, as there are changes that are being made to your kind of version, if you will, your version of the database, right? It's having to keep track of all those changes so that when it commits, it can push them all out at once. Okay. Now, that can slow things down. So if you don't commit, now only commit once you're ready for sure, but there's a relationship thing there, right? Advice there. Anyway, only commit once you're ready for sure, but if you do a lot of inserts and updates and changes to the data without committing, it can start to slow down a procedure. Okay, that's something that we dealt with again at the last company that I worked for, where we had a few stored procedures that just they took so long. And basically, if we threw some extra commits along the way inside the stored procedure, it would speed that procedure up substantially. And a lot of it is because before the commit, it builds up all the changes it's making, right? And then a commit says, okay, now it's all out there. Now I don't have to store that anymore. I don't have to deal with that anymore. So it can speed up your stored procedure, but like I said before, if you commit before you're ready, it can cause a lot of problems. Yep, William, you got a question, a comment?
So in Oracle, that's called snapshot too old. And what it has to do is when you start one query, it's going to save the state of the database when that query starts. And so what it has to do is it has to keep a copy of the old data until after it finishes running that query, so that even if you like commit after the query starts, that changed data will not show up in the query, at least in Oracle. So that's what's going on.
All right, thank you. Let's see. All right, so it looks like what we'll end up doing is we'll get to the end of these slides, take a break, and then we'll come back for some examples. I do want to talk a little bit about privileges and access control before we take our break. So we can give privileges on a table or a view, and we can give it like specific privileges. So we could say that a user can have select, insert, update, delete, references, and usage privileges. We can give all privileges to a table or view. We can give a subset of the privileges on a table or view. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. The way that we give privileges is we grant privileges. Okay. So we can either give a list of privileges, or we can say all privileges, okay, which would be all of them, basically. Right? And on, what are we giving it on? Is it on a table? Is it a view? We need to give a name for what we're giving privileges for, right? And then two, we can either give it to a specific ID list, specific authorization ID list, or public, which would be everyone. Okay. And then an optional with grant option. Now, with grant option means that whoever we give the privilege to, they can pass it along to. Okay, so if I am given all privileges on a table, I can then give those privileges to someone else too. I can run a grant statement to give those privileges to another ID as well. If I'm only given the privilege itself, but not with grant option, then I cannot pass those along. Okay. Public allows access to be granted to all present and future authorized users. So anybody that gets added at any point gets access to it. Okay. We can have a table, a view, a domain, character set, lots of things. Lots of things are objects. And again, with grant option allows the privileges to be passed. Okay. So here, an example here, we are giving all privileges on the staff table to the manager. So the manager ID or the manager role with grant option. So that means the manager can now pass any privileges, right? Any privileges on the staff table to other people. Now, that doesn't mean the manager has privileges to grant privileges on any other table. They can't give privileges to the branch table or to the property for rent table. This only gives them privileges on the staff table, and it gives them the ability to pass those on. Okay. So here is an example where we're getting specific privileges, select, and update on the salary column. So they can't update all the columns in the staff table. They can update a specific column on the staff table. Okay. What about, would it make sense to give insert on a column, on a specific column? Would that make sense? That if we would, because we can, I think you could understand how we could limit select to a column. You can only select certain columns from the table. You can update only certain columns in a table. Well, what about insert? We want to allow them to insert only the name on only or the salary. We want to insert only the salary on staff. Would that make sense? And if not, why not? Anyone? Got to finish these slides before we can take a break. One. Yeah, you guys have figured out by now if I ask a question in a certain tone of voice or a certain way, I'm probably, no, that doesn't make sense. We can't do that. Well, think about it. What do you, for update, it's only about changing an existing value, right? What is insert? Insert is adding a new row, right? So I can't only insert, if I'm adding a new row, I need to add values to any columns that are not nullable, right? So I couldn't insert only salary, because if I inserted only salary, well, on a staff person, they need a staff ID, they need a name, right? There's certain columns that are required, right? So I couldn't just insert only on certain columns, because all the other columns have to be filled as well. All right, so let's hurry up and breeze through these. We've got a couple minutes left. So we can grant select on branch to everybody. Okay. So revoke privileges. Revoke is taking them away. Okay. So we can revoke all privileges, which would revoke all privileges that have been granted. So if they've only been granted select and we revoke all privileges, we only take away select. Okay. We can tell who we're revoking it from, or we can say public, which would mean anybody we've given it to, we're taking the privileges away. Okay. All right. Okay. So if we look at let's talk about an example of how privileges may have been given and what ends up happening with them. Okay. Now, step one, we grant insert on staff with grant option. User A has ownership of staff. They grant insert with grant option to user B. User B then grants that same privilege insert on staff with grant option to user C. User E grants the same thing. So why they do that? Like, we'll see why in a second. But now this user E, okay, they didn't have to grant that to user C. User C already had it. But what we're going to see is that when user C then grants the insert on staff to user D, when this revoke happens, that's when this happens. That's when this is no longer in force, right? But because user C had insert with grant option from another source, they are able to continue. That's why this one is not blocked off. Okay. So let's say had this not been in place, okay? Let's say when user E grants insert on staff, they don't use the with grant option. Okay. Well, then when 5 had come, when this step 5 had come, revoke insert on staff, right? User B doesn't have insert capabilities anymore. User C still has insert capabilities, but they no longer have the grant option. So this one would also go away, right? So make sure you understand what I'm kind of saying here is that at the end of the way this works as it's shown in the original slide, right, is at the end, original, okay, the users that have the users that have insert capabilities, A, not B because it got revoked, C because it got it from user E, okay, D because it got grant option from user E, and E also. These 4 users still had insert privileges at the end of the way it's originally done. Okay, by making this one change with grant option, okay, the JL method, right? Well, A and E both, nothing changed for them. They had it natively, okay? Okay. B still lost it. Did C have insert still? Does C have insert privilege? Yep, they still have it because they got the insert privilege from user E, but they don't have grant option anymore. So D lost their privilege. D lost their privilege all because A decided to stop giving it to B. All right. Mean A. Okay. So we can revoke a specific privilege on an object from public, from everyone, or we can revoke all privileges from an object from a particular thing. We could also revoke all privileges on an object from public, right? We could revoke a specific privilege on an object from a specific role. Okay. All right. Now, when we revoke all privileges on staff from director, if director only had select and insert privileges, that's the only ones that get taken away. They didn't have anything else to be taken away. This is a way that we can say, okay, I just want to take away all of them. I don't need to know what they are. I just need to know that they don't need to have any more privileges anymore. Okay. Questions before we take our break? It's a little bit late. I'm sorry for getting us to the break late. Any questions before we end there and then come back and do examples? Yeah. Yeah. Right. So only DBA should have grant. So don't give grant option, basically, is what I think William was getting at there. Give necessary select and insert and update privileges to those who need it, but don't give grant option. All right. Okay, so let's take our break. It's a little bit late, 2:24-ish. So let's do 2:35. We'll come back and start up again.